The silver tray felt heavier than usual as I polished it, a rhythmic, soul-crushing chore that had defined my life for 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days. To the world, and especially to the man who owned this sprawling estate, I was Elena Rossi, a ghost in a navy dress and a crisp white apron, a woman whose primary function was to ensure the mansion ran with the silent precision of a Swiss watch. I'd become an expert at being invisible, moving through the shadows of the Luca estate while my own past as Anya Petrova remained buried under layers of domestic duty. I didn't have the luxury of being a person. In this house, I was merely a tool used to combat the legendary, Arctic isolation of Lorenzo De Luca. I checked my watch. 6 p.m. In exactly 60 seconds, the heavy oak doors of the study would open, and the dawn of the De Luca Empire would expect his espresso, exactly 190 degrees, no sugar, served in the porcelain cup his mother had brought from Sicily. Lorenzo was a man of absolute, terrifying order. He viewed the world as a series of moves on a chessboard, and I was the pawn he never bothered to look at twice. Dealing with him was like navigating a minefield in the dark, one wrong word, one decimal point out of place in the household accounts, and the silence that followed could freeze the blood in your veins. The intercom on the kitchen wall hissed. Rossi. The voice was like velvet dipped in ice. It meant he had found a speck of dust on a bookshelf or a second's delay in my response. I pressed the button, my voice a practiced mask of professional submission. Yes, Mr. De Luca. The guest list for tonight's auction gala at the Blackwood Manor. Why is there a discrepancy in the seating chart for the Romano family? I didn't need to consult a file. I had memorized the political landscape of the underworld better than the men who ruled it. Alessio Romano requested a table away from the ventilation system due to his wife's allergies, Mr. De Luca. I moved them to the west wing of the ballroom to ensure they wouldn't be distracted during the bidding for the primary assets. I sent the updated floor plan to your encrypted mail at dawn. Silence. The kind of silence that made the most hardened soldiers in his detail look at the floor. I just adjusted the napkins on the tray. Check the final page, highlighted in charcoal gray, I added. I heard the faint rustle of paper over the line. A long pause followed, the closest thing to a "thank you" I would ever receive from him. Fine, he clipped. The security protocols for the special items lot are missing from my physical briefing. They were delivered to your bedside table at 5 a.m., categorized by threat level with my personal analysis of the bidders' histories. Another pause. Longer this time. You analyzed the bidders. I analyze everything, Mr. De Luca. I had to. Because while Lorenzo was looking for threats in the shipping manifests, I was looking for the man who knew my real name. I didn't tell him that one of those special items on tonight's list wasn't a painting or a diamond. It was me. If this story pulled you in for even a second, kindly support me with likes, comments and also subscribe. It means the world to me. The silence of the De Luca estate was a living thing, heavy with the scent of expensive beeswax and the lingering chill of its master's presence. I moved through the grand hallways like a wisp of smoke, my footsteps swallowed by the plush Persian rugs. To any observer, I was the picture of domestic perfection, shoulders back, gaze lowered, hands busy with a silver lint brush. It was a role I had perfected until my real self, Anya, felt like a distant memory from a lifetime that had burned to ash. My morning routine was a choreographed dance of invisibility, airing out the library, ensuring the crystal decanters were filled with 20-year-old scotch, and placing the morning papers exactly 2 inches from the edge of the mahogany breakfast table. Lorenzo De Luca didn't speak as I moved around him. He was a man built of sharp angles and dark secrets, his presence occupying the room like a predator waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, not a look of interest, but the clinical observation of a man checking a machine for a malfunction. To him, I was just a component of his comfort, as replaceable as a light bulb. I preferred it that way. Invisibility was my only armor. But that armor cracked the moment I stepped into the servant's pantry to find a small, cream-colored envelope waiting on my workstation. It bore the wax seal of a golden scale, the mark of Silvio Marchetti. My breath hitched, the cold air suddenly feeling like shards of glass in my lungs. Silvio didn't send letters to maids, he sent notices to property. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. The message was brief, written in an elegant, mocking script that made my stomach churn. Debt recognized. Anya Petrova transferred to Lot 42, special items. Blackwood Manor auction. 9 p.m. The paper felt like it was burning my skin. Special items was a euphemism for the human trafficking ring Silvio operated under the guise of high society charity. My past had finally caught up with me, and the debt my father had died for was being called in, with my life as the currency. Rossi. The voice barked from the doorway, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I shoved the letter into my apron pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Lorenzo stood there, his dark suit immaculate, his expression a mask of bored authority. "You're 5 seconds behind schedule with the car keys," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my pale face. "Is there a problem?" I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced a small, submissive bow. "No, Mr. De Luca. Just a temporary lapse. It won't happen again." He lingered for a moment, his gaze tracing the line of my jaw as if searching for the lie. The air between us grew taut, charged with a sudden, inexplicable tension. He didn't know that by tonight, the woman who polished his shoes would be displayed on a stage for his rivals to buy. And as he turned on his heel and walked away, I realized with a sickening jolt that the only man who could save me was the one who didn't even know I was truly there. The transition from the shadows of the pantry to the blinding glare of Blackwood Manor was a descent into a nightmare I'd spent years trying to outrun. My Navy maid's uniform had been stripped away, replaced by a crimson gown that felt less like silk and more like a second skin, vibrant, exposed, and mocking. They had painted my lips a matching blood red and coiled my hair tight, transforming the invisible Rossi into the centerpiece of Silvio's grotesque collection. As I stood behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage, the muffled roar of the elite underworld outside sounded like the baying of wolves. "Smile, Anya," Silvio whispered, his breath smelling of expensive cigars and rot as he gripped my elbow. "You're about to be the most expensive mistake your father ever made." The curtains swept open. The transition was jarring, from the cool darkness of the wings to a spotlight so hot it felt like a brand. I stood frozen, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, staring into a sea of tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns. To them, I was Lot 42. A curiosity. A prize to be won between sips of vintage champagne. My heart beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a jagged contrast to the slow, rhythmic beat of the auctioneer's gavel. Starting at 500,000, Silvio's voice boomed through the speakers. Paddles rose. The numbers climbed with a sickening speed that made my head spin. 700. 900. I scanned the room through the haze of light, looking for a way out, until my gaze snagged on a figure in the front row. Lorenzo De Luca sat with his legs crossed, a glass of dark liquid in one hand, looking every bit the bored king of a dying empire. I expected him to be looking at his phone, or perhaps leaning over to whisper a command to his guards. Instead, he was perfectly still. His glass was halfway to his lips, frozen in midair. Then, he looked up. When our eyes met, the air in the ballroom seemed to vanish. His glacial composure didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. For 3 years, I had been the woman who brought his coffee and organized his life. Now, I was a woman in a crimson dress, being sold like a thoroughbred horse. I saw the moment recognition turned into a raw, territorial fury. His jaw tightened until I thought the bone might snap, and his eyes, usually as cold and unreadable as a winter sea, ignited with a possessive fire that made the spotlight feel cold. 1.2 million, a voice called out from the back. It was Rafael Cortez, a predatory smirk playing on his lips as he stared at me. Lorenzo didn't reach for a paddle. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He stood up, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the front row, and the entire room went silent. The gavel stopped mid-swing. The air turned arctic. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. His voice was a low, lethal vibration that cut through the opulence like a blade. "She is not for sale," Lorenzo said, his gaze never leaving mine. "Because she already belongs to me." The stillness that swept through the ballroom was more than a lack of noise, it was a total vacuum. Silvio stood on the podium, his mouth agape, the gavel hanging uselessly in his hand like a dead weight. The wealthy elite, the power brokers, and the monsters of the city looked on in stunned disbelief as Lorenzo de Luca crossed the floor. He didn't walk like a guest, he moved like a storm front, his dark presence swallowing the light of the chandeliers. 2 million, Rafael Cortez sneered, breaking the paralysis of the room. He leaned back, a smug grin tugging at his scarred face. "The girl is exquisite, Lorenzo. I didn't realize you had such fine taste in domestic help." Lorenzo didn't even look at him. He reached the edge of the stage, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight on my chest. I was trembling so hard the silk of the crimson gown hissed against my skin. 50 million, Lorenzo said. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible, followed by a frantic, terrified whispering. It wasn't a bid, it was an execution. It was the price of an entire empire, offered up for a woman who, until 6 hours ago, had been hand-washing his silk shirts. Raphael's face went pale, his smugness evaporating into a look of pure, unadulterated shock. No one followed. No one breathed. Silvio looked at the crowd, then at Lorenzo's hand, which was resting on the hilt of the blade tucked into his waistband. "Sold," Silvio croaked, the gavel falling with a hollow, pathetic thud. Lorenzo didn't wait for the paperwork. He reached up, his large, calloused hand wrapping around my wrist with the force of an iron shackle. He didn't pull me gently, he hauled me off the stage, my heels clicking frantically on the marble as I struggled to keep pace with his predatory stride. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, eyes wide with a mixture of judgment and fear. The silence that followed us out of the manor and into the cool night air was raw and furious. He didn't say a word as he threw open the door of his black SUV, his jaw so tight I could see the muscles leaping in his neck. He shoved me into the leather interior, the scent of his expensive cologne and cold anger filling the cramped space. As he climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door, the car rocked with the force of his rage. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The arctic silence of the office was gone, replaced by a heat so volatile it felt like the air might catch fire. I stared at my lap, the crimson silk a reminder of my exposure, waiting for the explosion. When he finally turned to me, his eyes weren't glacial anymore, they were burning. The drive back to the estate was a masterclass in suffocating tension. Lorenzo didn't speak, but the air inside the SUV was thick with the scent of leather and the ozone of a coming storm. When we arrived, he didn't lead me to the servants' entrance. Instead, he marched me through the grand foyer, his hand still a heavy, possessive brand around my wrist. We bypassed the narrow staircase leading to the basement quarters and ascended the sweeping marble steps to the master wing, a place I had only ever entered with a duster and a sense of duty. He stopped in front of a set of double doors directly adjacent to his own suite. With a sharp twist of the handle, he threw them open, revealing a room draped in gold and ivory, a space far too large for a ghost like me. He practically shoved me inside, the crimson silk of my gown flaring out like a warning. "This is your room now," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Mr. De Luca, I don't understand," I whispered, finally finding my voice. "I am your maid. My things are downstairs. My life is. Your life as you knew it ended the moment you stepped onto that stage." He cut me off, stepping into my personal space until I was forced back against the velvet headboard of the bed. "You aren't going back to the basement, Elena. Or Anya. Or whoever the hell you were pretending to be while you were polishing my silver." The door clicked shut with a finality that made my heart hammer. In the days that followed, the estate transformed from my workplace into a gilded cage. I was no longer required to serve, but I was never allowed to be alone. Lorenzo became a predatory shadow. If I went to the library to find a book, I would turn to find him standing in the doorway, watching me with a dark, unreadable intensity. If I walked in the gardens, I could feel his gaze from the balcony of his study, tracking my every movement like a hawk watching a field mouse. He began stalking me within the very walls I used to clean. He would appear in hallways without a sound, his presence a heavy weight that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer explanations, he simply monitored me, his silence a hovering interrogation. He was looking for the girl in the crimson gown, the woman who had secrets worth $50 million, while I desperately tried to cling to the invisible maid who knew how to hide. One evening, I found him sitting in my new room, draped in a chair in the corner, shrouded in darkness. He was just waiting. "What do you want from me, Lorenzo?" I asked, my voice trembling. He rose, the movement slow and fluid, crossing the room until the heat radiating from his body reached me. "I want to know why the woman who lives in my house is a stranger," he murmured, his eyes burning with a territorial fire. "And I want to know why I can't stop thinking about the man who tried to buy you." The following Tuesday, Lorenzo decided I needed air, though it felt more like a prisoner being marched to a courtyard for inspection. We sat in the corner booth of L'Eclissi, an exclusive restaurant where the light was low and the tension was high. I was dressed in a simple black sheath dress he'd had delivered to my room, a far cry from my apron, yet I felt more exposed than ever. Lorenzo sat across from me, his eyes scanning the room with the predatory focus of a man expecting an ambush. He hadn't touched his wine, he was too busy watching the way I breathed. The air in the room shifted the moment the front door opened. Rafael Cortez entered, draped in an overcoat that cost more than my father's life. He didn't head for a table. Instead, he walked straight toward ours, his eyes fixed on me with a disgusting, hungry familiarity. "Lorenzo," Rafael purred, stopping just inches from our table. "You've kept your new treasure hidden away. I was beginning to think you'd broken her already." I felt the temperature at the table drop to 0. Lorenzo didn't move, but the sheer force of his presence seemed to expand, pressing against the walls of the booth. Rafael leaned down, reaching out a hand as if to brush a stray hair from my shoulder. "You know, Elena, or should I call you Anya, my offer still stands. 50 million is a lot of money, but I would have paid double for a woman with your history." Before his fingers could touch my skin, Lorenzo moved. It was a blur of violence and grace. He caught Raphael's wrist in a grip that sounded like grinding stone. With his other hand, he signaled the restaurant manager, who appeared instantly, trembling like a leaf in a gale. "This man is bothering my guest," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Get him out." "Mr. De Luca, please," the manager stammered, looking at Raphael's guards. "Mr. Cortez is a long-standing patron. I can't simply." "How much?" Lorenzo interrupted, finally looking away from Raphael to fix the manager with a soul-piercing stare. I beg your pardon. The restaurant. The building. The land it sits on. Give me a number." The manager sputtered a figure that sounded like a fever dream. Lorenzo didn't blink. He reached into his coat, pulled out a black card, and tossed it onto the white tablecloth. "Run it. Now. And bring me the deed papers by dessert." The room went silent. Raphael's smirk faltered as he realized the level of insanity he was dealing with. Lorenzo stood up, leaning over the table until he was inches from Raphael's face, his eyes burning with a raw, territorial heat that made my heart stop. "I own this floor now, Raphael. Which means you are trespassing." Lorenzo leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the quiet room. "If you ever look at her again, I won't buy the building you're in. I'll burn it down with you inside." As security forcibly escorted a fuming Raphael out, Lorenzo sat back down and calmly picked up his wine glass. He looked at me, his gaze tracing my shocked expression, and for the first time, the Arctic boss looked truly dangerous. "Eat your dinner, Elena," he murmured. "No one touches what belongs to me." The following morning, the atmosphere in the estate didn't just feel cold, it felt lethal. When I entered the study, the sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it did nothing to warm the figure sitting behind the desk. Lorenzo wasn't reading reports or checking the markets. He was staring at two items laid out on the polished mahogany surface like pieces of evidence in a capital murder trial, a worn Russian passport and a sleek, encrypted burner phone. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it seemed to stop entirely. I had hidden those behind a loose brick in the wine cellar, a place I thought was sacredly overlooked. I was curious why a simple maid would need to know the ventilation specs of a ballroom, Lorenzo began, his voice a terrifyingly calm whisper. He picked up the passport, flipping to the page where my face, younger, harder, and devoid of the Elena mask, stared back. Anya Petrova. Born in Volgograd. Disappeared 3 years ago after a high-profile heist in Zurich. The Volkov's most efficient shadow. I stood perfectly still, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. The innocent Maid facade didn't just crack, it dissolved. I didn't reach for the items. I didn't apologize. I simply shifted my weight, my posture unconsciously mirroring the training I'd tried so hard to forget. "I wasn't a thief, Lorenzo," I said, the softness gone from my voice, replaced by a flat, steady tone. "I was a courier. I moved things that didn't want to be found. Information. Codes. Blood money." Lorenzo rose from his chair, his presence expanding until he seemed to eclipse the light from the windows. He crossed the room with the slow, deliberate stride of a hunter who had finally trapped his most elusive prey. He stopped so close I could feel the frantic heat radiating from his chest. "You worked for the Volkovs," he murmured, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a touch that was half caress, half threat. "My enemies. The people currently trying to dismantle my northern trade routes." "I left them," I countered, looking him directly in the eyes. "My father died to buy me a way out. I became Elena Rossi to survive, to be nobody. I thought your house was the one place where nobody would ever look for a ghost. Lorenzo's hand tightened slightly on my chin, forcing me to look up at him. The jealousy I'd seen at the auction was still there, but it was now twisted with something darker, a raw, dangerous fascination. You spent 3 years cleaning my floors while you could have slit my throat in my sleep, he whispered, his eyes burning. I chose to protect your home instead, I replied. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in until his lips were inches from mine, his breath hitching. You aren't a maid, and you aren't a ghost. You're a weapon, Anya. And now that I know what you are, I'm never letting you out of my sight. The uneasy peace of the Luca estate was shattered 48 hours later. I had been walking the perimeter of the rose garden, the cool evening air finally offering a moment of clarity, when the world went black. There was no sound, no warning, only the chemical sting of a cloth pressed against my face and the heavy, suffocating weight of hands that didn't care for the precision Lorenzo demanded. When I woke, I wasn't in a gilded cage. I was in a concrete one. The basement of an abandoned shipyard smelled of salt, rot, and the cheap cologne Silvio Marchetti favored. I was bound to a rusted chair, my wrists chafing against coarse rope, a far cry from the silk and soft shadows of the master wing. The invisible girl wakes up, Silvio sneered, stepping out from the gloom. Beside him, Rafael Cortez leaned against a support beam, his eyes raking over me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. You cost me $50 million and my reputation, Anya, Rafael whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow space. Lorenzo de Luca thinks he can buy the world just to keep you. I want to see how much of his empire he'll burn to get you back. He won't come for a maid, I rasped, my throat raw. You're not a maid anymore, Silvio laughed, holding up my encrypted burner phone. We sent him the coordinates. Along with a video of you looking, significantly less polished. If he wants his special item back, he has to come through the front gate alone. No guards. No backup. It was a suicide mission. Raphael had positioned gunmen in the rafters, a kill zone designed to turn the Arctic dawn into a memory. They weren't just kidnapping me, they were using me as the ultimate bait for a trap 3 years in the making. He's a businessman, Raphael, I said, trying to keep the Anya mask from slipping. He knows a bad investment when he sees one. He'll cut his losses. Will he? Raphael smiled, checking his watch. Because my scouts just reported a single black SUV tearing through the industrial gates at 100 miles an hour. It seems he's lost his legendary logic over you. The sound of tires screeching on gravel erupted outside, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a man who didn't care about stealth. My heart hammered against my ribs. Lorenzo was here, and he was walking straight into an execution. Get ready, Silvio hissed to his men, the click of safeties being disengaged echoing like a death knell in the cavernous room. Let's see if the Ice King melts when we put a bullet in his heart. I looked toward the heavy steel doors, praying for the first time in my life that the man I'd spent years hiding from would turn around and leave me to the dark. But as the doors creaked open, a familiar, terrifying silhouette blocked out the moonlight, and I knew the bloodbath had only just begun. Lorenzo didn't just walk through the doors, he erupted through them. The first 2 gunmen in the rafters didn't even have time to sight their rifles before Lorenzo suppressed 45 Hong Kong dollars barked twice, sending them tumbling into the shadows. But Raphael was no fool. Within seconds, a dozen more barrels were leveled at the man who had just traded his legendary caution for a maid in a crimson dress. Stop! I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. Lorenzo froze in the center of the kill zone, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto mine with a ferocity that ignored the red laser dots dancing across his heart. He looked raw, unraveled, the Arctic Don melted down into a man who had finally found something he feared losing. "Let her go, Raphael," Lorenzo said, his voice a jagged edge of a blade. "Take the empire. Take the ports. Just let her walk." Raphael laughed, a thin, oily sound. "I think I'll take both, Lorenzo. And I think I'll start by letting you watch her bleed." He nodded to Silvio, who reached for a jagged knife on the table. They thought I was the bait. They thought I was the prize. They had forgotten I was Anya Petrova, the woman who had moved through the shadows of the Volkov Empire for a decade. While they were focused on Lorenzo's dramatic entrance, I had been working. The rust on the chair wasn't just an eyesore, it was a weakness. I had spent the last 10 minutes grinding the coarse hemp rope against a sharp, jagged flake of oxidized iron. With a sudden, violent snap of my wrists, the fibers gave way. I didn't scream. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward, using the momentum of the chair to sweep Silvio's legs out from under him. As he hit the concrete, I snatched the encrypted phone from his belt. "Lorenzo, the freighter!" I yelled, diving behind a stack of rusted shipping crates as bullets began to chew the air where I had been sitting. "Cortez isn't moving drugs. It's a coup, he's using the auction funds to buy the Luca captains. The list is on the cloud server, password is his mother's maiden name." Lorenzo's eyes flared with a new kind of fire, not just jealousy, but the lethal pride of a man who realized his woman was a queen in her own right. He dived for cover, his weapon singing a symphony of precision as he picked off the gunman distracted by my breakout. Under the cover of the chaos, I bypassed the phone's security in seconds. I wasn't just Elena anymore, I was the courier. I bypassed Raphael's firewall and blasted the evidence of his betrayal to every loyal Luca captain in the city. "It's done!" I shouted over the thunder of gunfire. Lorenzo emerged from the smoke like a vengeful god, his suit ruined, his face splattered with blood, but his eyes were fixed solely on me. He didn't wait for the last of the gunmen to fall. He bridged the gap between us, hauling me up and slamming me against his chest with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs. For the first time, we weren't master and servant. We were an alliance of blood and fire. The cleanup of the shipyard was efficient, but the cleanup of our lives took much longer. 6 months had passed since the night the Arctic Don burned his reputation to save a woman the world thought was a ghost. The power vacuum left by Rafael Cortez had been filled, the traitors purged, and the name Anya Petrova had been officially erased from every database that mattered, replaced by a legal identity that was no longer a lie. I stood on the balcony of the De Luca estate, the evening air crisp and smelling of blooming jasmine. I was wearing a simple silk gown, but in my hands, I held the folded navy fabric of my old maid's apron. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. "You're still holding on to that piece of cloth," a voice rumbled from the shadows. Lorenzo stepped into the moonlight, looking less like a lethal predator and more like a man who had finally found a reason to stop fighting the world. He didn't look at me with the clinical detachment of a boss or the frantic possession of a kidnapper. He looked at me with a quiet, steady reverence that still made my breath hitch. "It's a reminder," I said softly, smoothing the white lace of the apron. "Of the version of me that was safe. The one who was invisible." Lorenzo moved closer, his warmth acting as a shield against the night. He reached out, his large hand gently taking the apron from me. He didn't drop it, he set it aside on a stone bench, effectively closing the door on the 3 years I'd spent hiding in his shadows. "I didn't buy you that night because I wanted a new toy, Anya," he murmured, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that always made my heart hammer. "And I didn't bid 50 million because I wanted to win a game." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, a diamond as clear and cold as an Arctic glacier caught the light of the moon. I bought you because it was the only way to stop the world from taking the only person who actually saw me, he said, taking my hand. For 3 years, I thought I was the one in control, but it was you. You were the one who made this house a home. You were the one who knew my mind before I did. He slid the ring onto my finger, a weight far heavier and more permanent than a maid's shackle. I don't want a servant, and I don't want a ghost, Lorenzo whispered, his forehead resting against mine. I want my equal. I want the woman who broke out of her own chains to save my empire. I looked up at him, the impossible man, who had lost his mind over a maid and found his soul in the process. I didn't need to be invisible anymore. Thank you, I whispered. For what? For seeing me, I replied, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like the right ending to a very messy story. Even when I was trying my hardest to be nobody. What an absolute ride that was. From the silent corners of the De Luca estate to the high-stakes chaos of the shipyard, Elena and Lorenzo certainly proved that some fires burn hottest in the Arctic. Since we've reached the end of their transformation from master and servant to a lethal power couple, I want to step out of the shadows and chat with you all about the choices made in this story. If you were in Elena's shoes, or rather, her sensible maid's flats, would you have stayed hidden for 3 years? It takes a terrifying amount of discipline to polish silver for a Mafia Don while knowing you have the skills to take down his rivals. Do you think Elena should have told Lorenzo the truth about being Anya Petrova sooner, or was her silence the only thing keeping her alive? We saw Lorenzo go from a man of Arctic silence to a man who literally bought a restaurant just to kick out a rival. Was that a romantic gesture of protection, or was it a major red flag? What about you? If you were the one on that auction stage and you saw Lorenzo stand up, would you have felt relieved or even more terrified? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which moment was your favorite. Thank you for staying with me till this moment, and if you'd like to support me, kindly like, comment and subscribe to the channel as means a lot to me. Till next time. Bye.